Adding to the extraordinary San Simeon experience were the guest accommodations. The 3 complete guest houses were set on the outer rim of the esplanade and opened onto the grand vistas beyond. Each carried out the theme of the Spanish-Italian villa. Casa del Mar, overlooking the sea, is the largest and perhaps the most gracious. While the big house was being finished, Hearst stayed here and slept in a 17th century canopied bed. His desk opened to a soft, almost mystical view through the trees to the ocean waters below. Like most of San Simeon, Casa del Mar, from room to room, 18 in all, is a visual feast. There's not a room or moment that the eye does not fall on grace and art and eloquence. At Casa del Sol, the House of the Sun, a bronze replica of Donatello's David stands atop a 17th century Italian fountain in full face to the western horizon. Dazzlingly Spanish is what they have called this house, flowered with vines of bougainvillea and dragons that mount the ironwork. Inside, the home features 8 sumptuous bedrooms and 2 living rooms. The Spanish theme is reflected in its vivid colors, texture, and style. Its windows open to the warm light of the setting sun. Casa del Monte is the smallest of the 3 guest houses, a mere 10 rooms. Its grandeur comes from the sweeping dimension of its vista of the mountains and gardens. The house features a bed said to have belonged to Cardinal Richelieu, who as minister to Louis XIII was a virtual dictator in France during the early 17th century. The headboard belies the story, since the coat of arms is of another family. But whomever slept here first, it now belonged to Hearst, and lies beneath a 17th century Flemish tapestry featuring the arms of a cardinal archbishop. Visitors not only stayed in the guest cottages, they stayed in the main house as well. La Casa Grande had some 38 bedrooms, and most of those were for the guests. The lucky ones who got the Doge's suite must have felt as if they'd fallen into another time and place.
The Doge's suite is similar to many of the guest suites in the respect that its floor plan is made up of a sitting room in the center with equal-sized guest rooms of equal dimensions flanking either side. But also there are things that make it unique, that make it different. There's a beautiful balcony with carved marble archways with cloverleaf-like design that you can see that's reminiscent of the balcony on the Doge's Palace in San Marco Square in Venice, Italy, and thus the name for this guest suite. Within the sitting room of the Doge's suite, you can see that Mr. Hearst collected not only fine arts and decorative arts, but also architectural elements, ceilings, fireplaces, doorways, and the like. In the center of the room, on the Spanish table, lies a carved basalt figure from Egypt dating back to the 3rd century BC. And here we see a ceiling with 2 components to it. The center oval-shaped painting is a Dutch painting from the 16th century that depicts the Annunciation of the birth of Christ to the shepherds. And the balance of the ceiling is carved and painted wood from Italy from the 18th century.
High within the cathedral towers, just below the bells, Hearst offered special guests the unique ambience of the octagonal celestial suites with incredible views. Julia Morgan designed 4 plush duplex bedrooms with a sleeping loft above, a sitting room and bath below. This one features curved, ornate balusters and mythological paintings on the ceiling to ponder before sleep. Hearst did not believe in serving guests breakfast in bed, so when the guests awakened, they made their way to the morning room for breakfast, coffee, gossip, and news. The kitchens nearby were massive to serve the constant flow of guests. At a time when most people still used ice boxes, Hearst acquired a brand new invention that they called the electric refrigerator. The first ones even had wooden doors. An old phone sits in the kitchen with a clear mouthpiece dotted with red crosses. It could be detached and sterilized, a vivid reminder of a frightening time. Hearst's living area took up most of the third floor. His bedroom was a surprisingly small but exquisite room with a 14th century ceiling replete with Gothic paintings. On the walls, a painting of himself as a young man, and one of San Simeon's rarest treasures, a Madonna and Child painted in the 1300s. His lampshades are made of 17th century parchment. Adjoining his bedroom was the Gothic sitting room, with ecclesiastical paintings and sculptures of the saints. It linked his bedroom with that of Miss Davies on the south front. When Hearst was at San Simeon, he ran his empire from a private Gothic study and the third-floor library. Hearst newspapers were flown in each day from distant cities to the estate's private airport. Hearst would scatter the papers on the floor and, according to one executive, sort of tap dance around and between them. A mild, uncostumed combination of Carmen Miranda, the rumba, a Russian dagger dance, and the Notre Dame shift. Hearst accompanied himself with the castanet-like rhythm of his snapping fingers. It was his way of checking out the picture's headlines and layout. For more serene moments, Morgan also designed an elegant library on the second floor. Available to guests at San Simeon were some 4,500 volumes, as well as Hearst's outstanding collection of Greek vases, rumored to be the largest and most valuable in the entire world. Almost every shape, style, and type known to exist were incorporated. With some 150 pieces, it remains today one of the most important collections of its kind.
Hearst and his contemporaries are considered to be the first generation of, quote, great American art collectors. And the great majority of what you see at Hearst Castle was actually bought in New York City at art auctions. And these things would make their way from mostly the southern European countries at this time. And these were buildings that were usually in a state of decay or neglect. There was a lot of political upheaval, changes in government, and so many of these precious art treasures and resources that you see preserved in places like Hearst Castle today would not be able to be enjoyed by the public or studied by scholars had not there been people like Kress, J.P. Morgan, J.D. Rockefeller, and Hearst that collected these things, brought them to the United States, and cherished them, and were good caretakers for them.
The Hearst empire was vast. Newspapers, magazines, and movies reaching millions of Americans on a daily basis. His was a powerful voice, and he did not hesitate to powerfully play his influence on the politics of America. It was a single Hearst phone call from San Simeon in 1932 that broke a convention deadlock and made Franklin Delano Roosevelt the President of the United States. Yet Hearst was not immune to the times. The Depression hit him like everybody else. Well, maybe not quite like everybody else. He woke up one morning and found himself $126 million in debt. Although change was both swift and certain, William Randolph Hearst wouldn't let the dream die. The legacy of that
Pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
The Depression years fell as relentlessly upon Hearst and San Simeon as upon the rest of the world. By the time the Depression ended and World War II began, Hearst was in his late 70s. But the glamour and the personalities that so lit up the castle in the 1920s and 30s would eventually fade in the clouds of time. Yet Hearst was ever the survivor. The war sold newspapers, lots of newspapers, and the Hearst empire once again boomed. He was clearly the most powerful newspaperman in America. But the one pervasive glory that remained, its spirit magnified by time, is the haunting beauty left by nature and by man on this enchanted hill. Hearst's obsessive drive to collect great art and surround himself in nature's wonder continued in the post-war era.
It's difficult to know whether Hearst was buying to furnish his various building projects or building to display his various art collections that he was acquiring, but he was a voracious collector. He collected in a lot of different areas. We have here at San Simeon his Spanish and Italian collection from the 16th and 17th century primarily, but he collected for a long period of time and was well known to the dealers in New York especially. Though he traveled Europe on a regular basis, he was able to acquire most of his collection in New York. New York had become the center of the antique and the art trade in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and Hearst did most of his purchasing there. He bought in vast quantities. What we have at San Simeon is literally a drop in the bucket when compared to the entire collection he once had. Because he collected so much, he had to, of course, have warehouses all over the country. In fact, his main warehouses were in New York and the Bronx. In the case of San Simeon, the collection would be moved from the warehouses in New York by train. Boxcar loads of things would be sent out to the Bay Area, into San Francisco, stored there temporarily, given a different number, then eventually moved down to the San Simeon warehouses. And there were 5 warehouses built here at San Simeon just to house the collection he hoped to use here at the estate. And then eventually things would be moved out of those warehouses and to the top of the hill. Even at the time of his death in 1951, those warehouses in San Simeon were quite full of materials that he hadn't managed to use here at San Simeon, but hoped to at some future date.
With the exception of a few years during the Depression, Hearst and Morgan never stopped building, changing, adding, and expanding San Simeon, adding an entire wing that still stands unfinished today. San Simeon is a feast for the senses, filled with surprise, delight, and endless breadth. It was health that finally forced Hearst to abandon the beloved enchanted hill of his childhood in 1947. He spent the last 4 years of his life in a relatively modest house in Beverly Hills, his great castle living only in his memories. Hearst died in 1951. But the great love and heart of Hearst was always in what he called his ranch overlooking the sea. The dreams the old man had for this enchanted hill of his youth still echo in the halls and in the moments of San Simeon. A legacy captured by an enduring love for art, beauty, and laughter. Not known as a poet, William Randolph Hearst did write some, including these words: "For life was born on the lofty heights and flows in a laughing stream to the river below, whose onward flow ends in a peaceful dream. And so, at last, when our life has passed and the river has run its course, it again goes back o'er the selfsame track to the mountain which was its source." In 1958, San Simeon was donated to the state of California and opened to the public so that all could share in the beauty and the dream of this enchanted hill. Gilded Age, symbols of opulence and wealth and power that seemed to explode out of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s. It was a time when they called these monuments of stone and marble mere summer cottages. The indulgence of the rich seemed out of control. In Arthur Vanderbilt's book,